Hi YouTubers, so I wanted to make a video just with my thoughts about it's a review of the New Testament and some of my concerns about it actually. But before I went ahead with it, I just wanted to say, I make a lot of mistakes and get a lot of things wrong, as we all do, sometimes more than normal, but I wanted to clarify what my thoughts were and why I felt that, so I thought it was helpful to make a small journal, some of the more important concerns and some of the reasonings behind it. So that's what I'll be referring to my notes. I felt that it was necessary to write a concise account of my various concerns of the collection of books known as the New Testament, so that my own feelings are recorded, and so also to try and explain some various reasons for why I came to those feelings. I also felt it might be a useful exercise to have a brief overview of some of the concerns, in the hope that it might also inspire some fresh insight into what are, after all, very old accounts. Discussing various concerns allows one to look deeper into why one feels a particular way, looking at how evidence is examined and questioning whether it's driven by reasonable deductions or if it's based on biases and assumptions. As well as concerns, there will also be interesting areas to note where there are perhaps also areas of agreement where texts may have some validity, in fact. But these just came off the top of my head, so they're not really in order of what I felt were most important points, but areas that had concerned me and that I felt some areas of doubt about. The first claim, I suppose, is the divine divine birth versus the Jewish ancestry tree. One of the most obvious contradictions in the vast document that is loosely described as the New Testament is that as the recorded parentage of Jesus, who I'll be referring to as the character that is recorded within those accounts. Where two conflicting accounts appeared to be referred to, although one has become much more accepted than the other, the Synoptic Gospels all make reference to Mary having a miraculous birth, allowing for a virgin birth, something also referred to in the Quran, although that states it does not mean a literal Son of God. Yet the whole basis for the Son of God theory in the New Testaments stems from this alleged miracle birth of a virgin. Yet contradicting this, seemingly, are the two accounts of the genealogy of this Jesus. One is in the Gospel of Matthew, the other in Luke. Both refer to the genealogy of Jesus through his paternal line, through Joseph. Matthew starts with Abraham, and Luke with Adam, and the two lists are identical between Abraham and David, although they do differ radically from David afterwards. If Mary had had a virgin birth, that would mean that Joseph was not a biological father, though. Only a stepfather or foster father, as the term may be today. Perhaps a foster or carer, but not a blood relation, in fact. Only Mary would be so. If Joseph is not the biological father, then why are these lists of his genealogy made at all? What reason would that have in any capacity? Why are there these lists, albeit different ones, making these claims that the prophets are all related genealogically? Both things cannot be true logically. Either there is a literal Son of God and therefore no patriarchal lineage as expressed, or if Jesus is connected through a Jewish patriarchal line as recorded, he cannot also then literally be a Son of God and born of a virgin. There seems to be no way logically to reasonably believe both things, of course. However, I have discovered that there are some apologists that would argue that Joseph's parental role was still legal and socially binding. Even if he was not the biological father, he still had that jurisdiction as a father under the laws of the times, perhaps Roman and or more importantly Jewish rules. Even as an adoptive son inherits his adoptive father's position. Thus, it could be argued, perhaps it's debatable whether there is a contradiction here that could be resolved or not. Do we really know what those laws were accurately and what relevance that they really have? And in terms of making the genealogical claims, I would still question where is the validity in making those patriarchal documents, and why not state openly if it is that a legal binding relationship with the father rather than a biological one? Why not state that and make it obvious? Or was that stated and has become something that's lost over the years? But in regards to the two different accounts, one can speculate, and there is also some speculation whether or not the patriarchal accounts are actually matriarchal ones, and that they're both different lineages of Mary's. But that would mean that those accounts were wrong and that there was incorrect information anyway. So it just seems like it's quite hard to know based on that, really. My feelings on that is why, if somebody's not the son of someone biologically, why list their actual blood relations going back that far unless that had a real relevance? That's kind of my thought on it, really. But I can see why some people still would argue that stepfather has legal jurisdiction, if not perhaps a biological relation. This is going to be the lengthiest chapter perhaps there is, and I've labelled it The Trial of the Sanhedrin, and my reflections loosely concerning the accounts of the trial of the Sanhedrin. All four of the canonical Gospels refer to this trial. The high priest and accompanying Jewish authorities are shown in a bad light. They reportedly mock and beat Jesus, and during the questioning he is condemned for a number of accusations, which are, in short, violating the Sabbath, healing people on the Sabbath, threatening to destroy the Jewish temple, sorcery, exorcising people by the power of demons. I don't mean exercise, I mean exorcism, I suppose it means. And claiming to be both the Messiah and the Son of God. Wow, that's some charge sheet, some list of accusations, huh? In the accounts, Jesus speaks very little, giving infrequent and indirect accounts to the priest's questions. A lack of response prompts the high priest at one point to ask, "Answerest thou nothing?" The men holding Jesus captive at the high priest's home mock, blindfold, insult and beat him reportedly, at times slapping him and asking him to guess who that was. It's clearly a very bad description of the priests, especially when allegedly they bring in false witnesses, but their witnesses do not even agree with each other. The accounts appear to contradict one another. All the hallmarks of a very unfair trial, you could say a kangaroo court, a bad trial sounding more like a rabble of robes indeed, rather than something meant to be a religious priesthood upholding sacred laws. In Mark 14:61, the high priest asks, "Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" To which Jesus, in the accounts, responds saying, "I am." At which point the high priest reportedly tears his robes in anger and accuses Jesus of blasphemy. In Matthew 26:63, the high priest asks, "Tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus responds with, "You have said it." Then in Luke 22:67, Jesus is asked, "If thou art the Christ, tell us." But he replies to them, "I tell you, ye will not believe. If I tell you, ye will not believe." And in 22:70, still in Luke, when asked, "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus answers, "You say that I am." At this point, the priests say, "What further need have we of witnesses? For we ourselves have heard from his own mouth." It is this claim of blasphemy which prompts them to refer him over to Pontius Pilate's court to ask the Roman authorities to judge and condemn them, accusing him of claiming to be the King of the Jews, but worse than that for the Jews, the Son of God. There are a number of serious claims here. Certainly, use of sorcery and using any demonic power over others would certainly violate any Mosaic laws and covenant with God that the Jews had. Yet in fact, the gospel accounts don't really provide any suggestion that these actually happened. And that's not what they allege anyway. The accounts therefore suggest that these charges are merely invented or hearsay. There are no accounts suggesting Jesus does any sorcery or anything demonic of that point. There are, however, accounts of him healing people on the Sabbath. So if those accounts are true, that part at least might be true. But there is a difference of belief in what is acceptable on the Sabbath. And my own view on that is that some professions do need to work on the Sabbath anyway, whether that's a healing profession like home carers, nurses, doctors, ambulance staff indeed, or whether that's police officers and those upholding law and order in society. And so that there are some professionals and exceptions to the rule of why some people would need to require working, even and especially in fact on the Sabbath, the guard against it, because diseases and crime don't take a rest, even though many people do feel duty bound to. So I certainly wouldn't take issue if somebody was working on the Sabbath, not if it was deemed for the necessity of society for the benefit of others. So the real issue I'm concerned with, I suppose, is the allegation of the blasphemy, something I myself take seriously. However, in our secular society, it doesn't really matter to the courts if people do go out and proclaim themselves as either gods or the son of gods, or children of gods, perhaps, literally. It may not be illegal here, although in other parts of the world it may be, but I would still consider it to be deceiving people personally, whether it's illegal or legal. I actually met a person many years ago who did make this claim to me, saying that he was a son of God. My own personal response was that he was quite arrogant, extremely arrogant in fact, to think that he alone would have a special divine connection any more than any of the rest of us might have if we tried. I actually felt that he was narcissistic and perhaps suffering from some psychiatric disorder, perhaps with delusions of grandeur. That I didn't say to him perhaps at the time though, but I've traded I tended to feel myself personally that all of us have an equality before God, and we're either all children of God or none of us are, in fact. And I felt when I didn't have a strong belief, or any belief actually, I felt there was no God, so there are no children of God, in fact. And I suppose having a belief, I tend to feel that everyone can have that connection, whether it's when one makes the effort and strives to more, or whether that's something that wavers or changes over the years according to one's behaviours and practices. But at the same time, we all at least have the possibility of having that close relationship, and I don't believe that any one or group of us has any closer, more divine connection, therefore, than any others. But they're only my beliefs, and I'm often wrong. But as an atheist, I didn't think any of us could have that relationship. But as a theist, I certainly think we all can have a close relationship. But I certainly don't feel, nor ever have, during this life, that I alone am the Son of God, which leads me to question, was there something I knew in a last life that I don't know in this life or haven't learned? Or was I perhaps grossly misinterpreted? If I was summoned today into a Sanhedrin or similar kind of religious court, I would simply say, no, I am just a human being. That's been the experience of my life. I've been flawed and made too many mistakes to count over the years. I sometimes wonder that God has put up with me and forgiven so much. I sometimes feel worse than some other people in many things, but in perhaps some other things I've learned patience and perhaps done well on some other things. I suppose, like with anyone, I'm complex and I've done well in some things and badly in some things in life. And that's partly due to life circumstances, but also, I would say, a reflection of my own choices, some of which were good and others were pretty poor, if I'm honest. And that could only be the honest answer if anyone asked me. That as a human being, I'm wrong sometimes and right sometimes. I'm strong sometimes and weak sometimes. And I no more have a divine connection than anyone else can have in this life. And if God has chosen me for any special role, it is only because God has chosen everyone for a different kind of special role themselves. though one is not always aware of what that role is, and one perhaps is always learning the nature of that and developing as that goes along. And therefore it's something that can change. And rather than any king of the Jews, I would say that no more than a modest secretary and one who tries to give information to other people. And certainly in terms of Jewish belief, God is the sovereign, in fact, and the Mosaics are the Mosaic commandments, indeed, are the message of God. That are infinitely more important than any messengers, although the interpretation of commandments is a crucial part of Jewish doctrine too, of course, and you can't really separate understanding of the law from the law itself. One necessitates the other. There have been occasional Jewish kings, exceptions to the rule, of course. I'm thinking perhaps in ancient times of King Solomon, and these are exceptions, but for the most part of their life, the majority of prophets did a whole variety of different professions. You know, they ranged from all different walks of life, from different classes, different races, indeed in different genders and ages, in fact, and all sorts of different professions represented. So in actual fact, I think that's more interesting as well, that people from all walks of life have a way of relating to stories of old, because of the appeal of all the different ages, genders, professions, classes and races represented throughout different prophetic journeys, which spanned hundreds and hundreds of years, if not actually thousands. So, in fact, the idea of there needing to be any kind of king within the Jews was the exception to the rule. Of course, there was King Saul, wasn't it? That didn't work out so well, and there was David, but those were exceptions rather than the rule itself. Nevertheless, although I may feel that is my response today based on my feelings, I cannot say absolutely that was always my position in the last life or even the life before that. I can't, because I don't have any memories from that. So, you know, that's the position that I'm in, I suppose. All I can talk about are the life and the accounts of this Jesus, and I refer to him in the third person because it's a person in accounts that are written about in the various books. It's not a real person. It's like when you read about someone in a book or any newspaper or journal, or even more likely today, a documentary or film, and you're referred to in those things. Well, of course, some of the things referred to may well be true in the accounts. Other things we may well want to question. And I think anything truthful would welcome any questioning that's fair, in actual fact. And only something that's afraid to be questioned and exposed as a lie would try to shun that and try to limit the amount of it, I would have thought. So I think fair questioning should be welcomed, in actual fact. But I would differentiate between a written report of someone and the actual historical account and the actuality of them in their person. That's why I referred to it in the third person, because sometimes there is that gap between what the records say in life for all of us, in actual fact. And it's worthwhile looking through it to see what we feel is truthful about it and where we feel there are wrongs. I have not performed any miracles or healed anyone on the Sabbath, never once, in this life at least to say, or on any other days of the week even. However, the fact that this has not occurred in this life doesn't necessarily therefore imply that it could not have had or happened even on previous lives. I may have been under different circumstances in a different life, for example, compared to this one. There's also the possibility of God allowing someone to perform miracles in one life, but not allowing it perhaps in another. At the very least, it does show that I alone, by myself, cannot perform any miracles through my own powers alone. Thus, we could conclude either these miracles came from God using me as an instrument merely, or did not occur perhaps. But yet the absence of any evidence in this life does not absolutely prove that there were not necessarily miracles in previous lives, since absence for evidence is not always evidence for absence. So we could only speculate why there are reported miracles in a previous life, but none of them that occur in this one. And I can only state the things as they are, and there can be various speculations of why. And of course, the Sanhedrin's charges in the accounts against this Jesus is not just for performing miracles. If they were, then of course, so too would Moses, Joshua, Joseph, and many of the other prophets whom God reportedly performed miracles through. They would all equally have been charged, even if historically. But no, it is the specific allegation of the Sanhedrin of performing miracles on the Sabbath or Shabbat, and also the accusation that the miracles were not miracles from God, but sorcery from demonic sources. The latter charge is refuted by the Gospel accounts, claiming all of Jesus' miracles were from God alone, yet the former claim, performing them on the Sabbath, seems to be accepted by those other accounts. In terms of performing on the Sabbath, there could reasonably, for my estimation, be a theological dispute on this issue, about this, based on what is and what is not acceptable on the Sabbath. The dispute seems plausible that the Sanhedrin might consider healing to be working and therefore against strict Levitical laws. Yet the counterclaim by Jesus or many others may have been that the more important laws, the Mosaic commandments, were still upheld, of keeping the Sabbath holy, since healing could be argued to be something that was holy. Others would counter that by saying that trying to preserve the physical body is not attending necessarily to the spiritual needs, but only trying to prolong the physical, which is the primary purpose of the Sabbath, to have a spiritual connection to God, not to keep one in the best physical health. Suffice to say then, there is a debate to be had within this, and a possible schism, a difference of sectarian views that could well be on the matter. And indeed there are those various sectarian differences that persist to the day. In terms of the alleged sorcery, why is there no account of Jesus denying this, as we would expect him to do? Surely he would argue that they have wrongfully diagnosed the source of the alleged miracles. Or did he keep quiet, thinking it was pointless arguing if their minds were already made up? Why does Jesus not answer clearly about the Son of God claims, though? If he knew, then why not answer more definitively, assertively, rather than these vague assertions, like, "You say I am, you have said it, and if I tell you, you will not believe me"? Is this the reason, fearing their doubts, yet still he could have been more forthcoming on his position and why he felt that? One might say you should expect, and one might say, why should anyone believe you if you cannot answer and give a credible, believable account? Especially if the claims you're making seem so dramatic, so absurd, so incredible. Only on one occasion does he actually answer in the affirmative, in Mark 14:61, where responding to the chief priest's allegations, he confirms "I am," leading to the accusation of blasphemy. One might have expected some debate here, some details as to why he says something so shocking, and to answer these charges of blasphemy. Does he believe it's that? If we are to accept the other accounts in the Gospels that Jesus believed in the Ten Commandments, referring to them allegedly several times, and in answer to how to inherit eternal life, even gives the answer of keeping the Ten Commandments. So if he does view these as vitally important, as sacred, then how does he reconcile his alleged belief of being a son of God with the commandment not to blaspheme and to worship only the Lord your God, and to have no other idols or gods before God? On such an important theological question, one might expect a reasoned response, explaining carefully his position, which might consist of many sentences. In fact, you would expect it not just to be paragraphs, whole essays, monologues, rather than these meagre 2 words, "I am," Does this not seem odd? Half a sentence, not even that, to what is a serious theological question from a man reportedly well read and spoken in theological texts, an orator and preacher indeed. A two-word answer. We really might expect a lengthy reply, both from the defence but also from the prosecution, as to why they both felt in their reasoning for why they did, why they felt it was so wrong to commit blasphemy, why he felt it wasn't blasphemy. You might expect some kind of reasoning or discussion at the very least. In fact, the court case seems to be quite empty of information, given the court cases are normally quite the opposite, especially when discussing complex issues where there may be strong differences of opinions or views, since there will be a need to justify and give clarity to the various positions, of course. The Sanhedrin court, however, is depicted like a kangaroo court. Anyway, with its use of its mockery, psychological intimidation, and its physical aggression, coupled with the false witnesses, of course. The physical and psychological intimidation could be a reason that one doesn't answer properly or fully. Perhaps the fear of provoking them into more violence, into more degrading insults even. And this brings me to the anomaly where uncertainty seems born. If one is running a bad trial, one doesn't go out and advertise one's own faults, especially if putting on an iconic person on trial. One attempts to show that it is a fair trial, even when it's not, so as to keep up a good reputation and publicity, and also so as not to stir up trouble or upset amongst others from the accused supporters. If you do physical and or psychological intimidation, you do it far away from the eyes of the world, behind closed doors, so that the question, begging, has to be answered therefore. How was the Sanhedrin alleged corruptions reported so accurately? How do we know there were mocking, insults and physical abuse in the home of the chief priests and by the guards? The alleged abusers would surely not advertise their own complicitness. Perhaps there were independent witnesses to later report, but why even allow them unless they were whistleblowers, undercover perhaps? Likewise, with the false witnesses, how do we know that the Sanhedrin themselves were implicated in this? They themselves would surely not publicise this fact. So, is it something witnesses discover and later explore, or is it some suspicion but without any actual proof as to why they said this? It's a pity that there's just not more information on and about the trial, a more exact transcription of the various court proceedings and the context surrounding it also. Who was present, and crucially, how this information was discovered and by whom. There could easily be a counter-theory that the Romans, or whoever, wanted to portray the Jews at that time in a bad light, casting them as unscrupulous, corrupt, using bad practices in their judicial processes. Simply, they could have written a version of history that they wanted people to believe. Could anti-Semitism have driven the Roman scholars to portray the Jewish authorities in such a contemptible way? Certainly there was a motive there. The Jews wanted an independent Judea, having their own authority, like the Sanhedrin, based on their own monotheistic beliefs and their own legal beliefs, rather than the Roman ones, rather than being subservient to the Roman Empire as a province or a state, which itself had more pantheistic beliefs. And of course, this all escalated many years later, decades later, reportedly in the Jewish-Roman War, where there was within less than a century, the Jewish temple was destroyed, the Sanhedrin's authority gone, and the Jews scattered even more. This is the context of those times. And so there is this possibility that the Romans had a reasonable motive in terms of their nationalistic goals and their theological beliefs to portray the Jewish authorities in a very bad light. I suppose the question is, would the Romans allow such a positive portrayal of such a group at that time? And As Winston Churchill famously wrote, history is written by the victors. So it is possible and plausible that the Roman accounts of those times skewed the versions of what the Jews were really and how they really lived. It seems quite plausible that Jesus and the Jewish authorities may have had some different sectarian conflicts at times, interpreting the Mosaic commandments differently. Arguments over these interpretations and their meanings of the law seems not only possible but probable, in fact. Even today, sectarian differences divide many people, and the schisms between them are possibly over an overly legalistic and unflexible authoritarian law. And those wanting a more sympathetic, flexible legal system, those schisms still exist today and probably have done over the centuries. Perhaps that kind of conflict between conservative law holders and more liberals is an inherent part of our wider human condition anyway, as it seems prevalent in many centuries and continents. Yet despite this theological dispute, one would wonder if there was not common ground between Jesus and the Jews. That would have been much more important than the alleged differences that they'd had. If one believes in the accounts, surely this Jesus must have believed in the Mosaic law. But surely also the Sanhedrin would have, surely too. They were not, unless of course we accept that they were only pretending to be Jewish. After all, gathering false witnesses is a violation of the Mosaic commandment, bear not false witness. Of course, it's possible that the Sanhedrin had not only been putting on the appearance of being Jewish as an act, perhaps they were collaborating to such an extent with the Romans that they allowed themselves to have become corrupted, disguising that corruption behind the veil of pomp and pageantry, ritual and ceremony. Even so, that does not answer the question. How were the Sanhedrin's court proceedings so easily and readily exposed? How is it that witnesses can be at the chief priest's home, seeing the alleged abuses, and then later testifying about the chief priests? Does the chief priest invite people to his home that will testify against him? Or has he misjudged their character, and the people he invites are really whistleblowers who later change their mind, or undercover agents? Without more details, it seems impossible to really know. But most plausible is that the chief priest will only invite those he trusts closely and knows well, unless he was deceived. When people all partake in a violence like this, they tend to all cover for each other, since they are all